Hi, everyone, and welcome to this Encore episode of the Global Missions Podcast. We have recently wrapped up the 7th season of the show, and throughout these summer months, we'll be representing some episodes from previous seasons.
That's exactly right, Maddie. Our production team will get a little bit of a break before really engaging with the work to bring new episodes to life. This will all begin in September. And if you, our listening audience, would help us with this, we've got 3 quick ways that you can participate in the process with us.
First of all, and probably most importantly, we invite you to complete our 2022 listener survey, which is linked in the show notes of this episode.
Number 2 is, and you can do this at any point, leave us a message using the contact form on our website or by emailing our team at info@globalmissionspodcast.com. Your input and suggestions are welcomed.
And thirdly and finally, if you enjoy this program, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you find your podcasts. We do value your feedback greatly, so thank you for taking advantage of these opportunities to share with us in planning for Season 8. Well, let's get into today's Encore episode.
Welcome to the Global Missions Podcast, a show for Christ followers who want to participate more effectively in God's work, both at home and to the ends of the earth. Visit us at globalmissionspodcast.com to find show notes, resources, and previous episodes. And now, here's your host, Rob Magwood, better known to many friends as Mags.
Welcome, everyone, to the Global Missions Podcast and to this, our final episode of Season 5. We want to thank you for joining us, for listening to part of this season, maybe different episodes over this year, and for your role in sharing the gospel with people who have not yet heard the good news. Well, we'll press on into today's episode. Our guest is going to help us understand the importance of being spiritually equipped for mission, no matter which people group or what type of ministry or how long a mission worker has been doing ministry. This is relevant. Ryan is going to identify principles that workers can apply to help them to walk in close step with the Lord Jesus and to have a vibrant spiritual life as they minister cross-culturally. Our guest today is Ryan Shaw, who is the International Lead Facilitator and President of Global Mission Mobilization Initiative. That's quite a mouthful, Ryan.
It is quite a mouthful. Sorry about that.
That's all right. It was this organization formerly called SVM2, the Student Volunteer Movement 2. Some of us are familiar with reading of the Student Volunteer Movement years ago. Ryan holds an MA in Intercultural Studies from Fuller and is the author of an excellent book. I'm going to recommend this book to you. It's entitled Spiritual Equipping for Mission, Thriving as God's Mission Bearers. Our organization, SEND, uses this book, and I know there are other organizations, Ryan, that are using it regularly, and we're glad to introduce it to our audience today. Ryan and his wife, Kelly, currently serve in Asia as mission workers in Chiang Mai, Thailand. Ryan, welcome to the program.
Mags, it's good to be here with you. I'm excited about the interview. And just to highlight that though I'm coming to you right now from Chiang Mai, Thailand, I used to live down the road in Dorchester, Ontario. So I know Dorchester and the area quite well. So it's good to be with you again.
Well, just before we started recording, Ryan and I were comparing notes, and I have visited Chiang Mai. He used to live in Dorchester, which is just on the east side of London, Ontario, where I live. We can picture where each other are today. We are some 13 hours apart on the timeline as we record this today. So, Ryan, would you begin just by way of introduction? Tell us a little bit about your ministry in Asia now.
Yeah, absolutely. So Global Mission Mobilization Initiative, it is a mouthful. So we say GMMI for short. So we were a student volunteer movement too. So if you know anything about the history of the student volunteer movement, that was focused on mission mobilization among student ministries. And so we did that there in Canada and in the US and several other countries. But then the Lord led us to Asia, not only to be focused on mission mobilization in Asia, but really the whole global South. So we do a lot of things in Africa and Latin America. And the emphasis is helping local ministries to mobilize and equip their own people for the Great Commission. And so we do that through books, through Bible studies, through mobilization tools, through trainings, lots of different ways that we help pastors and even denominations of different church networks in many different nations to really understand the mission emphasis of the Lord. So yeah, it's great to get to do that and be based here in Chiang Mai. It's a very good location for this kind of it's a hub location for this kind of a work. So we're real grateful to be here.
That's super. Now, along the way, you were led to put down some things. Waking the Giant is one of your books that I'm familiar with. And then came along this book, Spiritual Equipping for Mission. What led you to write this particular book?
Well, it probably started germinating in my heart more than 10 years ago now. My family and I were living in the country of Turkey, pretty difficult country. And we were beginning to come across attrition statistics of kind of why kingdom workers leave the field. And if they're leaving before they had planned to, what were the causes behind that, and kind of looking at attrition. And we recognized that with a lot of these studies, the one major issue that kept coming up over and over and over, it wasn't just kind of down the list, it was very high on the list of reasons for the attrition, was some area of character or spiritual life that was breaking down in some way. And that manifested itself in many different ways among teams or among units that were part of teams on the field. And this wasn't just in Turkey. This happened to be where I lived at the time, but the statistics that I was looking at were really global statistics. And so that just opened my eyes a little bit to say, okay, what is behind this issue? If these core issues of spiritual life are part of the reason why so many end up leaving the field, let's dig into that a little bit. And one of the things as I started digging was the pretty obvious recognition, unreached people groups are generally in fairly hostile or challenging, let's say, places. These places become a spiritual battleground. And I think that is one area that maybe is often overlooked in our preparation. We prepare culturally, we prepare for all the kind of the differences of this new location that we're going to go to. But sometimes we overlook that we're going into the hornet's nest. We really are going into the lion's den, so to speak. And we need to be equipped spiritually as much as we need to be equipped culturally, and as much as we need to be equipped with language and all these others in terms of training and what method of ministry we're going to do among these people that we're going to serve. Yes, all that we definitely need to do, but we need to add this spiritual equipping as well. So that's a little bit of some of the ideas first started germinating, and then I started studying and looking into this further at that point.
Well, I wonder, when you talk about spiritual formation and that it's spiritual work, would it be fair to say then that this material is applicable to a message bearer, we will come to that term, to a mission worker, no matter where they are serving and no matter what type of ministry or what the vehicle of ministry is? It applies to everyone as foundational.
Absolutely. And I would even take it a little broader than that. I mean, because of the nature of writing a book, you have to have a clear target audience. And so, yes, what you just described is the target audience, but even more broadly than that, it's for every believer, whether or not, you cross a culture, whether or not you cross a border barrier of any kind. These are our core kind of foundational keys to being effective just as a disciple of Jesus.
Yesterday, I had lunch with my son, who is a pastor of student ministries, and I had your book with me. I was telling him about preparing for this interview, and I opened to the 10 spiritual keys. We're going to come to that for our listeners in just a minute. We're going to share this list of 10 spiritual keys. But what I encouraged him to do was to take that list of 10, Ryan, and I said, if you could believe that those things would be true of your graduating grade 12 students, it applies to every Christ follower. And his eyes lit up with understanding, saying, yes. And can you imagine what world changers they would be, both locally and for those who are sent globally, if these things were true of us? So I've found this book very encouraging personally. There's been a lot of personal applications as well. So hopefully that'll come out too. It's for every one of us.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Let's go to this term, message bearer. It's a hyphenated word, message bearer. What do you mean by this term?
So it goes back to, I was in Nairobi, Kenya. This is over 17 years ago now. I was in Nairobi, Kenya, and I was speaking to a large campus ministry at one of the universities there. And I was talking kind of Wednesday night meeting, and I'm challenging for missions. I'm doing my mission mobilization for students spiel. You should become missionaries. You should become missionaries. Kenyans going out to the unreached peoples, becoming missionaries. So, as a speaker, when the words are just kind of going over the heads and there's this glossy-eyed thing, that's going on. And that was happening. And so I was getting a little frustrated as I'm talking. What's the disconnect here? What's not happening? So after the meeting, I went to the leader and I said, hey, I could tell there wasn't an understanding here at all. Can you help me gain some clarity about this? And so the campus ministry leader said, laughing a little bit, chuckling, he said, oh, that's easy. And I said, well, what was it? And he said, well, you kept using this word missionary. And I said, well, yeah, that's what we're talking about. We want to mobilize these young people into missions. He said, well, for young Kenyans, the way that they understand that term is the white guy with a pith hat talking about colonialism and pushing that. That is their vision of that word. And so it dawned on me, and I said, okay, if that is the case, I said, can I go talk for a little? It was about 500 or so in the group, so I couldn't talk to all of them. But I said, can you gather maybe 20 right now, go out and get them before they leave the meeting, and can we have just a little side meeting? He said, oh, yeah, sure. So we went and gathered 20 young people, brought them into a little room, and I said, okay, I'm hearing that this word isn't connecting. They all shook their heads. Yes, yes, yes. Do you understand what I mean by that? And then I explained, all we're talking about is you as Kenyans going to unreached people groups, either in your own country or outside of your borders, with the gospel of Christ, trying to spend as long as you can there. So not necessarily just a short in and out type thing. And I said, so what would be a term if this missionary term isn't connecting? You guys tell me, what's a term that does connect? And they kind of looked at each other a little bit back and forth, and they came out with this term, message bearer. I loved it immediately because I said, that's it. That's what we're called to do. We're called to bear the message of Jesus Christ, no matter what culture we're from. We need every culture. And that's a lot of our work with GMMI, is helping these global South type nations recognize their own calling and their own responsibility in sending out workers. So from that point, it just kind of stuck. And, as I've researched mission history and whatnot in my seminary days and all, came to realize, it's that word was great for back in the day, but in our day, in a lot of the contexts, at least that we're dealing with, the non-Western context, it really has a lot of baggage. And so just kind of wanting to be aware of that as we use the term. So that's kind of where it came from.
Super. It's a really healthy refresh, I think. As you've mentioned, here in North America, there are also certain preconceptions of what it means and what it looks like. And so it offers that opportunity, I think, to just kind of, in a positive way, re-enliven the conversation and say, let's think about this again. Let's set aside some of the preconceived notions there. Ryan, you have talked about how important the inner life is. This comes to that idea that this is real for every Christ follower, really, but especially perhaps. This is a short quote from Ryan's book. Effective message bearers have many inner life commonalities. These are found among all disciples and not merely message bearers, and yet they are particularly applicable to those serving Jesus in the Great Commission. Would you describe what you mean by these inner life commonalities?
Yeah, so with these 10 keys in the book, what we're really looking at is spiritual disciplines that are being formed within the life of believers. So they're not completely formed yet. We still have a long ways to go, a lot of development still to make, but they're spiritual disciplines that are growing, which in turn produce fruit. So when we talk about the inner life commonalities of effective disciples, these are spiritual disciplines that we're saying, yes, I need that. I want that. I want to grow in that particular area. And I think that's the Lord provoking and prompting that desire, because it's those things actually that enable us to produce the fruit. So yeah, it's this commitment to grow in these areas, having these inner life commonalities that we're talking about.
Sure. No, that gives us another way to get a hold of these ideas. It's a newer term, commonalities or inner life. Now, there is a list that Ryan uses of 10 of these spiritual keys. And I'm really aware that on a podcast, it's hard to listen to a list of 10 things. I'm just going to read through them quickly, though. And then, Ryan, let's unpack a little bit more. We won't be able to do all 10, of course, but I'd just like folks to have a sense of this. So these are the 10 spiritual keys. Number 1, being saturated with the powerful presence of God. Number 2, embracing humility. 3, hungering and thirsting for God. 4, being clothed with God's word. 5, discerning God's guidance and revelation. 6, pursuing a lifestyle of prayer and fasting. 7, cooperating with God's twofold purpose. 8, understanding the times and seasons of God. 9, persevering with steadfastness and stability. And number 10, pursuing a focused life. So it's a great list. Ryan, you talk in this list about how we need to work on these things, but we also cooperate with God. Just before we talk about any specifics, what do you mean by cooperating with God?
Yeah, so I think what we're talking about is recognizing the need to align with the heart of God and his purposes, that we need to walk according to his ways in the purposes that he's given us. So in this great commission that he's given to us, he has some specific ways that he wants to accomplish that. And we're familiar, I think, with how often the Bible has many, many promises that God gives, and yet included often in those lists of promises are conditions. There's this idea that, okay, God says, I've got a promise for you, but I need you to walk in some ways of aligning your heart with me, cooperating with me, so that you can accomplish some things and so that you can come into these promises. What we're talking about is walking according to the ways of God as he reveals in the word, so that we're doing it his way, is another way to put that.
And we are then working out our salvation as he does his work in us?
Well, he's working through us is the key idea. He's working through us. So we're cooperating with his heart, enabling him to then work through us. And I think that's one of the key messages throughout the book, is the need for us not to always be trying so hard to produce fruit in our own human strength. Very normal, very natural, very common response to do the work for God in our own human effort, in our own human strength. Very common in mission circles and ministry circles of all. But I think what we're saying is, no, let's come back to what are his ways of doing this, not relying just on our own strength, but cooperating with him and walking in his ways of doing these ministry things that he calls us to.
Well, you've had lots of experience presenting these ideas, Ryan, and encouraging others to follow them. I wonder, how do these spiritual keys help make message bearers more effective in their work generally? What general fruit do you see?
Yeah, well, I think, again, coming back to the inner life commonality and recognizing that ministry flows out of who we are becoming. I like to use that quote. Ministry flows, the Bible, Jesus told us, it's the living water flowing through you out and touching many other people. So when we recognize that all spiritual ministry, all spiritual influence, really, it comes out of that living water flowing through us. And so, again, coming back to that principle that I highlight so often, I just mentioned it, the common reality of ministers, of message bearers, working real hard for God, but our spiritual life, or that living water that is inside of us, it can easily go dry. And often not because we meant it to. It's just the busyness of ministry, the responsibilities, the pressures, all of these things, they begin to push on us, and we don't give the time to these disciplines. We don't give the time to the spiritual life kind of side. And so maybe I can answer that question best by giving a negative example. I was speaking at an international church here some time ago, here in Chiang Mai, and I was talking about prayer and the need for missionaries, message bearers, to have a strong prayer life and giving ways that we can walk in that, etc. And a brother came up to me afterwards, after the service ended, and he said, "Thank you for sharing. I've lived here in Chiang Mai. I'm a missionary. I'm a message bearer for 20 years. I've been here." And he said, "I'm just going to be honest with you. I don't have a prayer life." He said, "I used to. But over probably the last 15 years, he was very honest, very vulnerable with me. He said, I haven't had a prayer life." And so I dug a little bit with him and I said, "Okay, so tell me a little bit. Can you see a correlation between that and fruitfulness, either inner fruit in your own life and then outer fruit in your influence on other people's lives?" And he said, "Absolutely." He said, "I've just kind of dried up inside. I have no joy. I have none of these things. And the outward influence has also shrunk quite considerably." And so I think that just gives us a kind of an example, a taste of the importance of being so rooted consistently in the Lord and guarding our hearts, because the temptation in leadership, in ministry, to allow that part of our lives to kind of easily go by the wayside. It's very, very tempting. And so we have to constantly be reminded of, no, these, and the list could be 100 things. These are just 10 keys that kind of we've highlighted. But the point is, we need to consistently be feeding that spiritual depth and that encountering, if you will, the Lord himself on a regular basis through his word, through prayer, through some of these other keys that we talk about in the book.
Well, it's a great truth, I think, and a sad story to illustrate, but we know it's not the only one. It's one of the reasons why I've appreciated Ryan's book so much and recommend it enthusiastically. It helps put a frame around some of these most important things. And here I'm going to read just another sentence, Ryan, from early on. Ryan wrote this: "We are very rarely taught ways to thrive spiritually. It seems the assumption is that we intuitively know how." And that's what Ryan's pressing against, that we don't intuitively know how to feed ourselves spiritually and to thrive spiritually. In fact, what's more typical is the story you've described, where we're distracted. And that's why this book is so helpful. That's why the keys are so helpful, I think. Well, we have these 10 keys before us. In just a moment, I'm going to ask Ryan to help us unpack the first spiritual key, which is to be saturated with the presence of God. Just before we get to that part of the conversation, we'd like to share with you this mission resource that we hope will be helpful to you and your church.
Would you like to be more intentional about praying for God's work around the world? Are you looking to help your church pray for the nations? OperationWorld.org offers many prayer-enhancing tools to help you, including prayer calendars, videos, an app, and other resources. The Operation World Handbook has been used by over 1 million people and is the definitive prayer guide to every nation. You can hear more about Operation World right here on the podcast by listening to episode 63 with Molly Wall. Check out OperationWorld.org today. And now, back to today's conversation.
We're back with Ryan Shaw, who is the International Lead Facilitator and President of Global Mission Mobilization Initiative, or GMMI, as I heard him say a few minutes ago. We're discussing why the 10 spiritual keys he's mentioned are vital in the life of a message bearer. The first spiritual key is to be saturated with the presence of God. Ryan, please just take a few minutes and describe this spiritual key.
Well, it really came out of one of my mentors from Fuller Seminary, where I got my master's. He has this quote, and he's Bobby Clinton is his name. He's a guru in spiritual leadership, studying it from looking back at the biblical figures and leaders and drawing out of so many leaders, both in history and biblical, all these things, commonalities. And so he has this quote. He says, "The essential ingredient of spiritual leadership is the powerful presence of God in the leader's life and ministry." And so what I think it does is that brings us back to the base theological kind of concept that it's God in us that produces fruit among those that we minister among. So it's not us doing the work, though we're, as we said, we're cooperating, we're partnering with God and walking these things out. And so in the book, we look into some of those biblical figures and specifically looking at this particular line that shows up. And usually it's in the Old Testament context, but there are New Testament references to the same idea. And the concept is this, that the Lord was with them. So about David, it says this. About Moses, it says this. About Joshua, it says the list goes on and on and on. The Lord was with them. And so I began to study that out a little bit, looking at all the different figures and leaders and what was it about this fact, the Lord was with them? What did that produce? Well, that was the key ingredient, as Dr. Clinton says, of influence. So when we influence another person, yes, we can influence from a kind of a worldly perspective or from our human personality, charisma, persuasion, all those elements of communication technique and all of that. Yes, there is that. But that actually doesn't produce the spiritual fruitfulness in another person's life. Now, that can potentially lead to it, but those elements in and of themselves, they could excite somebody, but that doesn't necessarily mean spiritual growth. And so really to see the spiritual growth in another human being, the Lord has to be working in us and then through us to touch another person. So that's what we're talking about with this idea of saturated with the powerful presence of God and wanting to be those types of message bearers, those types of leaders in general who are producing that kind of fruit because we're walking in his presence. We're living according to his presence. We're talking to him day by day by day and walking according to those ways. And so in the book, we really flesh out a little bit more of what that looks like and then a little bit more of what effectiveness on the field looks like when some of those things are in effect. And so we can take a little bit more look in the book. Individuals can do that. But yeah, I think that in a nutshell is what we're getting at.
Give us just a little taste of some of those things that you recommend, practices that we might pursue. Someone who's just getting interested in this, what does it include to be saturated or to step towards saturation, if we say it that way, with the presence of God?
I like to, whenever I look at a spiritual principle, I like to kind of look at the flip side of it, the opposite, if you will. So if we're talking about what it looks like to be saturated, well, what's the opposite of that? That helps me kind of understand things. And so when I think of the opposite of being saturated with the presence of God, it's operating in my own human strength in ministry. So, okay, I've been called by God to do a work. And then I go out and I begin to work in my own ability. I kind of leave God by the side. It's very easy to do, again, in the temptation of busyness and pressures and all these things. And we begin to operate in ministry according to our own abilities. We each have natural abilities. So message bearers, missionaries who go out, they have skills, they have abilities. And so it's very easy to begin to rely, I think, on those abilities to be fruitful in ministry. And again, God gives us ability, but at the end of the day, he wants his power to be enabling those abilities. So it's still him that's producing the fruit in another person's life. So that's helpful to me to say, okay, the opposite is operating in my own strength. And now I need to really be deliberate about saying, God, forgive me for that. That's my natural inclination. Lord, no, I want to wait on you. I want to do the necessary disciplines to allow you to be the one flowing that living water in me and through me that's really going to be touching the lives of people that I minister to. That's a bit of an example there.
Mm-hmm. How much better that way than to do it in our own weak little efforts. Boy, we could spend all day unpacking this. And in fact, Ryan does do a ministry like this. That's one of the reasons why it's so rich. Ryan has been working on this and working to articulate it for a long time. That's just an idea, a little bit of the first chapter. And there are 9 other chapters, so to speak, to explore there. Ryan, many of our listeners are leaders in local churches. They may be pastors. They may be on missions committees. They are wanting to help message bearers thrive and do a good job, to be well prepared. What role can church leaders and missions committees play in helping message bearers grow in these 10 spiritual keys?
Well, I would suggest just really having a strong emphasis on biblical discipleship. I actually just led a group of interns here through a study on Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, kind of an in-depth study, and just kind of being wowed and a little bit surprised at the standard of discipleship that Jesus gives us in that Sermon on the Mount. And again, we can't attain that level of discipleship because he raises the bar pretty high. We can't attain that in our own human effort, but really putting a high bar out there. I know sometimes, we don't always do this on purpose, but it's sometimes easier to, in our society and culture and whatnot, to kind of lower the bar a little bit. And so one of the suggestions I would make is to keep a strong emphasis on the biblical discipleship and what Jesus really calls us to, how he calls us to live. And then just really rooting people in deep spiritual life. So for those that you're working with that are message bearers out in countries already, talk with them. I was going to use the phrase, hold them accountable, and maybe to some degree, but just how you doing in your spiritual life? How are you maintaining in the midst of busyness, in the midst of pressures, in the midst of COVID-19, all these things? How is your spiritual life? Are you dry? What can be done to kind of invigorate you spiritually again? And then those are the ones that are out there, but the ones that you're preparing in your local church right now for the future. Yeah, I would say take these guys as deep as you possibly can in spiritual discipleship and emphasize that as much as you're emphasizing the need to be prepared with the best ministry technique and the best books on culture and all those kinds of missiological approaches. Make this a similar and as important part of your mission preparation.
Well, I think that's really important to note. You're not downplaying at all the readiness of skills or talents or experience or capacity to be a teacher or a doctor or a worker or of any sort. You're saying that there are foundations undergirding those talents and skills and that they complement each other, right?
That's exactly right. We need those preparations to be effective workers for the kingdom, especially among unreached peoples. So we're not downplaying that at all. We absolutely need that side of our mission preparation. What we're saying is this side is so easy to overlook, however. And I would add, I think especially in our Western worldview, that training, preparation, more the skills side of getting ready to go serve overseas somewhere, that often takes priority. And then getting the support and all those things that you got to do to get ready to go. Man, I know so many message bearers that get to the field and they're spiritually burned out really before they even get started. Just they've arrived and now they're like, okay, I'm burned out because it took so long just to get here and all the steps that it took to get me here. So yes, it's important, absolutely, to highlight the training side, but this is often the overlooked piece that I think is so essential.
Well, we have, as we often say, just scratched the surface of this topic. I want to again encourage the consideration of Ryan's book, Spiritual Equipping for Mission, Thriving as God's Message Bearers. And I think, Ryan, I'm going to recommend it broadly. If you are a worker yourself, if you are a message bearer, this book could be helpful to you. If you are serving in an agency and you are seeking to help people prepare or to discern where they need help, this would be a helpful framework. And if you are in a church, if you're a pastor or on a missions committee, it would provide such helpful insight as to how you can support and help cultivate healthy spiritual foundations in the lives of our mission workers or message bearers. Just warmly include that to you. Ryan, we're going to include the book in the show. I just wonder, are there any other resources that you would like to mention to our listeners?
Yeah, I would encourage people to go to globalmmi.net. That's our website. And we do have quite a few Bible studies on some of these topics related to the spiritual equipping side. We've developed several, like looking at different Bible passages, even the Sermon on the Mount that I just mentioned, and kind of highlighting what we can learn about the depth of the spiritual life. So in our ministry circles, we talk a lot about this subject and really try and prioritize it as a key element. So yeah, globalmmi.net. There's a lot of resources on there that I think could benefit.
Super. We will include that in the show notes. As regular listeners know, you can find the show notes for this episode at globalmissionspodcast.com. Ryan, if any of our listeners would like to follow up with you, reach out about some of these questions or ideas, how could they do that?
Yeah, probably the best is by email. rshaw@globalmmi.net is my email address. That'd be great.
Super. Thank you for being open to that. Last question, just as we conclude. Ryan, if you had the opportunity to stand in front of a group of folks comprising the leadership of our sending churches, these are the pastors who would love to see message bearers thrive, the missions committees that are seeking to support those workers and to stimulate the church more broadly. If you could address that group, what would you like to say to them?
Well, I think as a historical principle that I learned back in seminary when studying out the mission movements of the past, you can't get away from this principle when you study out how God has moved in mission mobilization circles, especially, is the connection between spiritual awakening or spiritual depth or revival, whatever term you want to put in there. Spiritual awakening actually is the precursor, and we could say can produce real missions vision. So in our mission mobilization efforts, we always come back to this principle of how can local churches take their people real deep in the Lord, as deep as possible, really seeing how to create environments where spiritual awakening can be conducive so that your members are really connecting with the heart of God and really encountering the Lord in some fresh ways. I've found as we look through history and even in contemporary circles, those folks that get most excited for mission are often the folks that have and are going consistently deepest, if you will, not to compare, but deepest in the heart of God. And there's some correlation there. So I would just encourage pastors and mission committees to see that principle and say, how can I apply that? How can I apply that in my local church setting to say, okay, mission mobilization can be, and most often is, a direct result of people really going deep with the heart of God, the spiritual awakening kind of side of things. So yeah, not only is it important for the life of missionaries and message bearers on the field, but it's actually one of the key motivators, if you will, of people being mobilized and equipped on the front side. So yeah, do everything you can to get people wholeheartedly in love with Jesus. Just prayer meetings and yeah, just one-on-one discipleship, going real deep with people, not being content with kind of that common superficial level that we're all familiar with and we all want to get beyond, but it is so difficult sometimes. So I just leave you with that challenge of seeing what you can do to create that environment of spiritual awakening. And obviously it's a work of God. It's a work of the Holy Spirit. But there are ways, again, to cooperate and to partner with the Lord in creating those environments in our ministry settings.
It's a great word. Lead people more deeply into the heart of God. A great word of wisdom. Ryan, thank you so much for the time and energy invested in creating a book like this for us. And thanks so much for spending this time with us today on the Global Missions Podcast.
Well, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to get to talk about these issues. I love what the Lord is doing around the world. And I love seeing people who are embracing these spiritual keys and seeing the corresponding fruit in their lives and ministry. So thanks for the opportunity.
Well, we're finished another episode packed with some great ideas. Remember to check out the show notes to scan through those resources and the related episodes here in the Global Missions Podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, would you leave us a review in Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast app? We would appreciate your feedback, and it helps others decide if they will give this podcast a try. Thank you in advance for spending just a couple of minutes doing that. This episode is brought to you by the Global Missions Toolbox and produced by Send International in collaboration with other like-minded agencies. On behalf of our team, thank you for listening. Join us again in 2 weeks when we'll continue to explore this grand adventure of being Christ's witnesses to the ends of the earth.